administration. He also served 10 years as an elected office in Loudoun County, including 4 years as the county supervisor. He lives in McLean and ran for state and senate in District 37 last year as a Republican. He is an Orthodox Jew who has been to Israel 3 times and has relatives and friends there. He holds a BA from Rutgers and a Master's of Arts in Journalism at the University of Missouri. He has twins at the age of 27. Please welcome Ken Reed.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak. I want to thank Eric Burson, who could not be here today, for inviting me. And I also want to thank you. It's also great to be here right at the end of Passover, which ended yesterday. So thank you for having those rolls at the table. I had, 3 maybe? I must have had at least 3 rolls. I forget. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about the impact of the war on the American Jewish community, okay? And this is, so that's me at a pro-Israel rally in Oakton, and that's where I got these little signs. These are the pictures of some of the people who are being held hostage still, or at least we think they're still being held hostage. Some could be deceased for all we know, but I got this at this rally. So this is an email I got from Erica. I asked her, what do you want me to talk about? So she said, well, it's been 6 months since the horrific attack on Israel. A look at where we are now as civic-minded Americans, religious or not, could be a good starting point. How is your synagogue community feeling about things like, where is it safe for these kids to attend or apply to college? If I remember correctly from your campaign by, you worship at Chabad in Arlington. It's actually in Herndon, where I go mostly. And how can persons of goodwill-minded Americans fight rising anti-Semitism? Support for Israel's handling of the war has dropped. These are calls that were done in March. I was supposed to speak last month, but because the electricity was out of this building, I couldn't come, and this meeting was postponed. But there was a Gallup poll in late March that showed 54% of Americans sympathize more with the Israeli, but it found that 31% sympathize more with the Palestinians. And approval, and now a majority of Americans, according to a Gallup poll, oppose the way Israel is handling the war. Approval has dropped from 50% to 36% since November. So why is this the case? Well, I can tell you, as somebody who has been involved in Judaism for well over 35 years, who has studied this issue very closely, that this is a problem that goes back a long ways. It goes back probably to the late 70s or 80s, when bipartisan support for Israel started to wither. And right now, what I would say is the big problem is that Hamas, the terrorist group that launched the attack on October 27th, killing 1,200 Israelis, raping numerous women, cutting off the heads of babies as well. I mean, I can just go on and on, but we just had lunch, so I don't want to go into more detail. They've been very effective at using the media and infiltrating a lot of institutions of society to support the quote-unquote Palestinian cause. The American media, like for instance, this number of 34,000 people who have been killed is an exaggeration. And everybody reported that the media will, if they're decent, will say that that's according to the Hamas health ministry. And they're just doing gradual increases based on just saying everything is increasing. There was a data scientist at Penn, Wharton School, who refuted that, saying that their numbers are very exaggerated. And even right after that, Hamas came out and said that there's about 13,000 that they can't really be sure if they were killed, if they're civilians or not. So those numbers are exaggerated, but that's what's leading to the cries that Israel is treating genocide and extermination. The Nazis killed more Jews in one day than have been killed in 7 months. That's genocide. And American media is very, very sympathetic to the underdog. They just are. I've been a journalist since 1980. I'm retired now. I have been in the publishing business, and I know how reporters think, and I know where they're coming from. And social media, especially TikTok, reaches a lot of youth. I just heard the news the other day that TikTok has 50-to-1 pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas videos versus pro-Israel videos. And Jewish groups were very united after the attacks. They held massive rallies. There was one on the mall that I attended. It was unbelievable. It was very peaceful. It was excellent. There were speakers from both political parties. There were actors and actresses speaking, including Deborah Messing, who's a Bernie Sanders supporter in his campaigns for office. But it's kind of died down. Unfortunately, the zeal, we're not as in your face and as violent and as provocative as the Muslim and Arab groups in this country and their allies in the university. And so what's happening is it's having a deleterious effect on the coalition, especially in the Democratic Party. I don't know too many Republicans who are against Israeli action. I know of maybe 2 in Congress that are more isolationist and are not in favor of what's going on. But by and large, the problem right now is with the Democrats, and it's because of the election, and it's because Michigan is a pivotal state, and there are other states with a large Arab and Muslim population, and they're afraid that they're going to lose those electoral votes to Donald Trump. There's also division in the American Jewish community. We are not united as Jews. We aren't. This is the thing that I have a hard time explaining, especially to my Republican friends, when they ask me, why is it that so many Jews vote Democrat when they're not as hard on Israel as we are, Republicans? The reason why is because not a lot of Jews are really involved in Jewish things. They're assimilated in this country. Assimilation is done a lot here and in Europe and even in Israel itself. We're in a situation now where only 9% are Orthodox in this country. Orthodoxy is growing, but it's not growing as fast as people who have no particular branch. That's now number 2. 20 years ago, the conservative movement, which was more in line with supporting Israel, was the number 1 religious affiliation amongst Jews, followed by Reform. It's now reversed. And some 60% of American Jews are not members of the synagogue. The more older Jews support Israel than younger, but most still identify as Democrats. I estimate between 70 to 75% of American Jewish voters will vote Democrat in a presidential election, and probably the same numbers in local and state elections. When they ask about Israel, 58% of American Jews now say they support restricting military aid to Israel so it can't be spent on expanding settlements in the West Bank. The West Bank is the disputed area between Jerusalem and the Jordan River. Okay, it's this area that was under Jordanian control until the '67 war, and that's really been the major focus of conflict the last 50 years. Is the control over the West Bank, Judea and Samar, as we call it. So 31% said that Israel was committing genocide against Palestinians. These are Jewish kids saying this. This is not all people. This is what the polls are showing. But the more involved you are in Judaism, the more likely you're going to be pro-Israel. If you have more of a Jewish identity, so Orthodox Jews, the Jews who are, let's say, involved in their local federation, or they're a member of Hadassah, or Zionist youth groups, they go on to Birthright like my kids did. They're more apt to, if you've been to Israel a lot, chances are you're going to be pro-Israel. But as you can see from these statistics, under half of Jewish adults have been to Israel. That's it, 45%. Has anybody here been to Israel? Ah, good. When?
Well, it was in the early 90s.
Early 90s, okay. Is that during the Intifada?
You know, I'm not sure. I went with a group of elected officials from DC,
Oh, you did?
Arlington, and Maryland.
So you're an ex-politician like me?
I am.
Welcome to the
What
club.
have you done? It's for 25 years.
Oh, wow. I'll talk to you later. Oh, yeah? Okay, good. I'll have to talk later. So anyway, so there are very few who've actually visited Israel, and that's part of the problem, is that a lot of the students who are protesting and a lot of the people who are questioning how Israel is prosecuting the war don't really have all the information about what Israel is doing. Like, for instance, when Israel bombs a building, they send out flyers, and then they do a test bomb that's to get people out of their way and get out of the building. That's what they're doing. They're not carpet bombing, which is what the protesters are saying. They're basically looking at the Israelis as if they were the Nazis or the United States in Vietnam. Now, much of what influences Israel is politics. This is very interesting. Only 31% of American Jewish voters have a favorable view of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This is a November poll. About 27% of American Jews were positive about Trump in 2021. It's almost the same. What I find is with people who are more secular, people who are more liberal, don't like Netanyahu, they don't like Trump, they see the two of them as being symbiotic, and that's what influences the opinion of Israeli policy. So therefore, you may hear a lot of people on TV saying that, oh, I don't hate Jews, I just don't like Israel or Zionism, but there's now an International Holocaust Remembrance Association effort around the world to add anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. Because that's really where we are today. The old-fashioned anti-Semitism of people being excluded from a country club like this because they're Jewish, or Christian-based anti-Zionism, which was very prevalent in Europe, is really dissipated. The anti-Zionism the last 30, 40, 50 years is really anti-Semitism is really anti-Zionism. So as a result, you're seeing a large number of Democrats, even in very Jewish areas, coming out for a ceasefire. Why? Because most of their Jewish voters support a ceasefire, probably. They don't like what Israel's doing. They're peaceniks. They think that there's another approach that can be better, and they don't look at the fact that just 8 years ago, the Iraqi army, joining with the United States, had an assault on ISIS in Mosul that killed 20,000 Iraqi citizens. There was nobody uttered a peep about that. Nobody uttered a peep. 20,000 Iraqi citizens were killed, civilians, in that conflict to wipe ISIS out. Maybe it's because Obama was president and they didn't care. So Erica's other question is, how is your synagogue community feeling about things like where is it safe for the kids to apply to college? Well, I'm trying to be very, very, impartial here. I'm trying to take a journalistic approach. There's certainly more security. Like our synagogue in Reston has a guard posted on Saturdays. He's a volunteer, his wife's Israeli. Most synagogues have more security conscious actually since the October 2017 killings at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was by a white supremacist. There's been a lot of gatherings, IDF, Israeli officials, but again, if you're not affiliated with a synagogue or any Jewish organization, you're probably not really listening to the facts necessarily. So you're seeing a lot of people with blue ribbons. I left some Israeli flags on the table, which you're welcome to keep. And there's a lot of posters like you see here of hostages. You go around and you'll see free the hostage, you'll see a lot of that. Some of those have been vandalized, maybe one in Maryland. But colleges, by and large, the media are reporting the extremes of these protests. But daily life for Jews on these college campuses the last 20, 30 years has been difficult. It has been very difficult to express your support for Israel, even if you're a non-Jew. There have been lots of reports of problems that have been occurring through the years, and this is largely because of the exposure of students to, look at this, 70% of Jewish students exposed to anti-Semitism this year alone. But a lot of this happened because they were becoming racially diverse. I mean, let's be real. I was a supervisor in Loudoun County. Some of the brightest students were Muslim students. They're Pakistani, they're from Middle Eastern families. They practice Islam, and they're getting into these universities, and that's their right to do that. but they look at this very, very differently than Jews and most Americans. They look at this very, very differently, and a lot of the students you see who are involved are now Arab Palestinian. They're not Palestinian. Well, Arab Palestinian is Arab, okay, but Muslim, a lot are Muslim, a lot are just regular Arab Christians who are supportive. So, and then there's the influence of multiculturalism in the universities, DEI, and all these speech codes and everything, where it's made a very difficult time for people to have any kind of a discussion, a back and forth discussion, which you think college campuses are about. It's like one way of thinking and that's it. This is an example of how it's influenced the media. There's now a revolt going on at the New York Times about how they're covering the war. There's a lot of reporters there on staff who think the Times is too pro-Israel. Well, if you talk to any Jewish groups, they'll tell you the Times has been anti-Israel. A lot of their coverage going back to the 80s has been anti-Israel. Now, they're being accused of being pro-Israel. So this editor from the New York Times was quoted in the Wall Street Journal saying that colleges aren't preparing new hires to be tolerant of dissenting views. Young adults who are coming up through the education system are less accustomed to this open debate, this robust exchange of views around issues they feel strongly about, et cetera, et cetera. This is a result of what's gone on in education since No Child Left Behind. Is basically we teaching to a test. So this is the right answer, that's the wrong answer, and that has now led to a situation in K-12 education that if you use the word illegal alien, you're a racist. If you are not open to different gender choices, you're a bad. It's good, bad, black, white. That's what's going on. But let's be honest, on the conservative side, I mean, Fox News, Newsmax have been playing up this stuff ad nauseum. If you watch the last couple of weeks, if you turn on CNN or MSNBC, more than likely the coverage in the beginning is about the Trump trial. At least 20 minutes into the program, you have to wait to get any information about what's going on in Israel. They frequently will suppress key facts to create a storyline that makes the Palestinians look good. And conversely, the conservative media is doing the opposite. They're doing the opposite. And so it really depends upon the correspondent. Like Jake Tapper at CNN has been extremely sensitized to the Israeli situation because he interviewed the rape victims and the hostage families. So his reporting will be a lot different from someone else on CNN. It really varies. So it's the balkanized media, it's due to the division of the country. So are Jewish parents and students making different choices? I don't think so. I know you're hearing in the reports about decline in people being interested in Ivy League schools. Look, they get 75,000 applications every year. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, you probably have less than a 10% chance of getting accepted. If you're even from a Jewish family, and you get accepted into one of those schools, are you really going to turn it down? I don't think so. I really don't think the preponderance of students are really doing it. Now, Orthodox, they won't go to these schools at all. The Orthodox are different. They won't even send their kid to a state university. Now, that in red there was what I wrote last month. Much of the violence has died down. That was before the big student protest. So I have to now erase that. That's in my handout, and it's now a couple of weeks old. And it seems that the activists are trying to bring this to the Chicago Convention to relive the glory days of 1968. We'll see what happens. Because now the NYPD has confirmed, this is not in your handout, that much of these protests were organized by career agitators, some of whom have committed violence and are known to police. And I hope that comes out. I hope we find out who these people are, because I think they're also involved with the 2020 riots that caused 19 deaths, 2,000 injuries, and $500 million of property damage. So are we reliving the Vietnam War? This is not on your slide. Well, I lived through the Vietnam War. I was very young at the time, but I lived in Princeton, New Jersey, where students took over the Institute for Defense Analysis, which was not even really involved with Vietnam, but it was a symbol of the military-industrial complex. And the one thing that I remember is they weren't targeting Vietnamese students. There were no Vietnamese students. They were now if you were at ROTC, you were probably very uncomfortable on campus. And ROTC buildings were taken over and vandalized. So it's very similar. It is somewhat similar. The difference is that Jews are an oppressed group of people that need a state, okay? The Vietnamese had a country for hundreds of thousands of years. Well, it was under colonial rule. The draft was inequitable. It fell on the working class. A lot of the students back then were at risk of getting drafted if they didn't get a deferment based on grades. It was only in 1970 when Nixon went to the lottery system, and by then the war was de-escalating. So students probably had more of a worry back then than today. Today, I'm sorry, I think a lot of these people are just being agitated by ideology and by bad information. And, you know, it's, it to me is not the same. Maybe I'm biased because I'm Jewish, but, you know, we're talking about Vietnam. How many people were killed in the Vietnam War? Does anybody know? Vietnamese?
Vietnamese.
About 4 million. Over the 30-year period, about 4 million Vietnamese were killed. Much different conflicts. So what can you do? Well, I gave you those Israeli flags. And this is Erica's last question. How can persons of goodwill mind, I think she means, how can persons of goodwill fight rising anti-Semitism? Show your colors. You're the best, you're the best that we have. You are. I don't know if anybody here is Jewish or not, but even if you're not Jewish, stand tall. I mean, but look at these posters that are being put around cities. That's not the work of white supremacists that Jews control America. That's not. There's even posters saying that rape is okay when you're dealing with oppression. I've actually seen that, and they were calling for global intifada the other day. The intifada was a massive uprising against Israelis back in the late 80s and early 90s, and I think also in the early 2000s, which killed a lot of Israeli citizens. But this attack is the worst. This attack on October 7th is the worst that Israel has had since the 1948 war, actually, in terms of casualties. I would say fight all the bad isms. You know, we all believe in inalienable rights, and we have to look at anti-Semitism in the same way as trying to combat racism, homophobia, anti-Christian attacks, people for their beliefs. Here's Linda Carter, the actress. She tweeted, "You don't have to be Jewish or have Jewish loved ones, as I do, to fight anti-Semitism or celebrate Judaism. Empathy makes us more human. Never again means never again, period." And that's her with a Israeli thing on her head. There's Senator Fetterman with these little dog tags. They've been handing those out to people for the hostages. So he wears those. And this is also very reassuring here. American Jews today have more allies than we had in the 1930s and 40s. In the 1930s and 40s, you would never see a bunch of Republican Congress members or even Democratic members stand up at a microphone in support of Jews. Never. You wouldn't see it. They were afraid to really provoke anti-Semites, and they were afraid to bring in more immigrants into this country. And that's why Roosevelt closed off immigration. So it was a bipartisan thing back then. So now we have allies. And that's what I'm asking you folks to be, as an ally. And that's what you can do. You can show the Israeli flag, and you can stand tall. And, you know, if somebody comes up to you, you tell them, you know, yeah, I support Israel. They have a right to exist. They're a democracy. Jews need a safe place. And that's where I'm going to end here. Anti-Semitism rears its ugly head anywhere. Before this happened, the two countries that had the worst, the two countries where Jews felt the most unsafe were France and Greece. There's been a rise, you probably don't know this because you don't read the Orthodox press like I do, but France and Greece, prior to all this happening, was a very unfriendly place for Jews, and a lot of them emigrated to Israel. Jews can come under attack even in this country, and having a Jewish state prevents things like the Holocaust. It prevents Jews from being at the whim of whatever that power wants. So in Russia and the Ukraine now, ironically, we're fine. Believe it or not, we're fine. But it can happen, it can turn the other way. All it needs is Vladimir Putin or Zelensky or somebody to start blaming the Jews for something, and then all this old stuff comes out. So that's why Israel is important, and it has to be safe. We have to finish off Hamas and Hezbollah, and Iran must be held in check, and I think held responsible. A Palestinian state free of terrorism is a good thing, if that can happen, but it must guarantee Israeli security. And I must tell you, frankly, that I think the Netanyahu government really botched this whole thing from the beginning by ignoring all the warning signs, and that's been coming out in the Israeli press. They're already doing an investigation of what happened, that they left the southern border basically completely unprotected, transferred troops to the West Bank because of the Simchat Torah celebrations that were going over there. I mean, it's a long story, but Israel allowed for all these tunnels to be built up, and they should have gone to the UN right away and got a resolution from the Security Council when things were emotional on their side, supporting their efforts and maybe even forming an international coalition on this whole issue. Because when they took those hostages, they attacked every country in this world. Americans were held hostage, Germans, French, people from Thailand, Mexico, and that's something that I think the Israeli government failed on. So, but we're now in a situation where there's a war, and we have to carry forward, and I hope that you folks will stand tall and support us. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
Can I have two questions? One being, and I know you're not in the Middle East, but I don't really kind of understand Middle East politics, but why doesn't Egypt let the refugees in?
Because Egypt had Gaza under their control until 1967. And then when it came time to give it back, they didn't want it. So Gaza became it's not a nation.
Right.
That's the problem here, is Hamas moved in when the Israelis pulled out their troops and their people in 2006. Egypt and a lot of these countries don't want refugees. I mean, that's the other thing that's, a country has to agree to take refugees.
Right.
That's one of the reasons why there was a migrant crisis why these refugees were coming to Europe with ISIS, was because a lot of the Middle Eastern countries didn't want tents set up. So they were coming, and they were welcomed in by the Europeans because they wanted the low-cost labor. What's the other question?
The other question is the hostages. I remember a time when hostages were like on the front page of the newspapers, or the front page of the news, American hostages. We've heard about it constantly. I don't even know how many Americans are hostages. We don't know anything about
I
them.
think seven are still being held
But we know
hostage.
nothing about them, men, women, kids, youth.
Yeah, I mean, there are, Israelis sometimes have dual citizenship. There are a lot of Americans who live over there, like my first cousin who's over there in Efrat, she's American, so she still has American citizenship. The media will try to talk about it every once in a while, but I can tell you in Israel, there's an intense pressure on Netanyahu and the war cabinet, and that's one of the reasons why they're not going into Rafah just yet. It's not just because of the world opinion that's afraid that they're gonna bomb the hell out of civilians and kill more people. It's because the Israelis want to see if they can get those hostages back. That's why they've been negotiating the last couple of weeks. There was a video of one hostage who's American just a week ago. Hamas put that out to show, yes, this one person is fine. But frankly, if you talk to any person who's an expert in this, probably very few are still alive. I'm sorry to say that.
That's the problem.
Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
It seems to me, following the history of it, the Marxist movement seems to have kind of commandeered the anti-Semitism and used it as a weapon to kind of push their agenda. Would you see that being
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
it definitely. I
But
mean,
what? To what gain? I don't understand why.
It's just this mentality of haves versus have-nots, that There's some people who are better off than others, and the Marxists believe it's because they stole it, or they used guile, or they used something else. And so therefore, Israelis and even Jews are considered to be wealthy and white by these people. And the reality is that a third of Jews are not even white. They're not. They're not white. But yet, in the United States, it sure seems like most Jews are white, and they're pretty well off, right? And so they're well off, and so therefore, they're oppressing, they're the oppressors, they're the colonial settlers in the West Bank. And they come up with all these terms and terminology to make it look as if they were imperialists who moved in and took over and threw all the Arabs out, without telling the other side of the story that at the time of the State of Israel, there were over 1 million Jews living in North Africa and the Middle East who were all expelled. They were pretty much all expelled from their countries when Israel was established. And yes, there were a lot of Arabs who left Israel. They didn't want to be under Israeli governance. So, yeah, you know, it's a perfect dynamic. And they try to compare it to how blacks are treated in this country, or Native Americans, or any other non-white group, indigenous people. That's why they're looking at it. And they don't want to face the fact that Israel was sanctioned by the UN. Okay, so the Soviet Union and China did not vote. They let that resolution go through, and they created a Jewish state. But a lot of Arabs cannot live with the idea that there's a Jewish state in the Middle East. If there was a Christian state, if let's say Lebanon was taken over by Christians, it'd be the same thing. It would be intolerable to the thinking of a lot of Arabs.
Do you expect the result of kind of this adoption of anti-Semitism to progress to even worse state? It seems to me like this is just the beginning of probably they're gonna keep pushing this agenda, which surprised me that they actually adopted the anti-Semitism, because it just seems like it comes through.
They don't view themselves as being anti-Semitic. The protesters and the people, I heard Michael Moore the other day, who's a radical, filmmaker. Oh, we don't hate Jews, we just don't like Netanyahu and his militant government. It always comes back to using, sound bites and cutesy phrases, loaded things like genocide, and you're a settler colonialist, or you're an imperialist, and using these terms which the Marxists and the revolutionaries used, in the Russian Revolution, Cuba, just name the revolution. Marxism requires there be an enemy. Okay, there has to be an enemy, and the enemy is usually the bourgeoisie, the classes, and this neo-Marxism, which has taken over the universities the last 50 or so years, maybe more than 50 years, has seeped into the social sciences, seeped into K-12 education. And that's really what we're seeing. And they've utilized the 501c3 status to actually allow rich people to take tax breaks on funding groups like If Not Now, or Student for Justice in Palestine, or any of these other far left groups. And they shouldn't be doing that. Congress has not acted appropriately because they can't act on anything. They can't even pass a budget, right? So, that's where we're stuck. We're stuck with very old laws and rules where people have used loopholes. Universities get money from Saudi Arabia and a lot of other, nefarious places, which are not really, Saudi Arabia is going to about to join the Abraham Accord, so we'll see what happens there. Any other questions, or I think we gotta wrap up, right?
I think so, yes.
Thank you so much.